Hello and welcome back to the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. My name is Clay Wright, and it's good to be back here with you. And I met with Charlie Miller.
Here I am.
Charlie Miller, welcome to the podcast.
I'm here. Welcome to the podcast. You preached as well, so
thank you. I did, yeah. So we had in-person preaching at each of our campuses this week. So that means Charlie got to preach in Avon Lake. I was preaching here in the Elyria campus where we're recording. And we also had John and Jason preaching as well, although they said they were too cool for us. No, I'm just kidding. They had a lot of other stuff going on. So this is actually our second time, just you and I on the podcast.
It's true.
I think the last time that was before we were preaching monthly, because I think I preached. It was the last time I got streamed to all the campuses. Because I think Pastor Jim was out of town, and so then you came.
I think this is the third time, because I was on one other time when no other campus pastors could make it.
Really?
Yeah, and then another time I interviewed you, and here I am. So I think other than Jim, I may be your most frequent guest.
Denver Daniel has been on
Denver
at least twice.
I'm in the running for number 2, though.
Jonathan Abdul, dude, in the early days, have you listened to from episode 0?
I haven't.
See? You're not a true fan.
I'm not a true fan.
Jonathan Abdul was on a couple times talking about finances during the...
the Adventure of Trust.
Yeah, the Adventure of Trust.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think he was on 3 times, though. Maybe he'll have to preach sometime, and then he can...
That's right.
You guys can have a...
But I'm up there in top 5, maybe.
For sure.
Yeah, keep falling down. Not top 2, but top 5, maybe.
And so something that people might not know about you and I is Charlie and I, we work together, obviously, but we also love to talk about the scriptures together. So I love doing this podcast with Pastor Jim just because he and I have like this really natural sort of mentor-mentee relationship where I love asking him questions. But Charlie's another guy who
burp in the mic. I'm sorry. Too many goldfish. Carry on.
Charlie and I talk about the scriptures a lot as well, especially like when we're getting ready to preach. We meet and we talk about things. So we have some similar sayings, like sometimes that'll come up in our preaching, which is pretty fun. Like, for example, this past week, we both were talking about scratching people's backs. And there's no history there between Charlie and I, although on occasion, we will scratch one another's backs.
That's right.
But anyhow. So why don't we start off like this? Why don't you just share? Well, maybe we can read the scripture that we were preaching out of, just in case folks are tuning in and haven't listened to the sermons yet. Which, if you haven't, maybe you guys didn't know, we actually have another podcast that we produce as a church where we post all of our sermon audio. So I think it's called Church of the Open Door Sermons. We also post the sermons to YouTube. But if you guys are needing to catch up and you like podcasts, that may be something for you to check out. But regardless, let's go ahead and I'll read the text that we were preaching out of, or that we were assigned. And then, because I think you preached verses 35 and 36, didn't you?
I did. I edited them in last minute.
Yeah.
But I really, we'll get into it, but the earlier part was where I was getting most of my, but for the sake of the context and the flow, I wanted to continue through.
Yeah.
So
I'll read it, and then we can kind of share where we were at in the text. So we were starting in verse 31 of Luke chapter 6, continuing on in the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus says, "Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full." So Charlie, where did the Lord have you as you were studying and kind of seeking things for your congregation?
Yeah, so we were our focus, what Pastor Jim gave to us, was to think about loving those who love us, or those that I would consider our inner circle.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, if you see the graphic, the sermon graphic, there's circles about thinking about the different circles of friends that we have, our spheres of influence. And so we talked a lot about enemies, those that insult us, and now is a chance for us to think about those that are close to us. And so one of the things that I realized, and this was in our conversations, and I want to hear more from you on this too, but how Jesus was making assumptions, about his audience when he uses the language of, if you love those who love you, what good is that? What credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And he kind of goes through that whole list. It was making some assumptions that, well, naturally people listening there would say, well, yeah, of course I love those who love me. And what he's trying to say is, we're called to do, as believers, we're called to a different kind of love, something that's not easy or transactional, because loving those that love you, you're going to get something in return.
Yeah.
And so, because initially when you read that, you're like, well, loving those that love you, is it wrong of me to love my wife or my mom or my friend or you? Well, no. The point is, what's rooted deeply in that kind of love where if I scratch your back, you'll scratch mine. It's transactional, right?
Right.
It's ultimately about myself. Knowing what I'm going to get in return frees me up to do something for that person. And the love that Jesus is calling us to when he says love your enemies is the same love that he's calling us to for loving everybody, including those that are close to us. And that's a love that's not transactional, that doesn't have conditions, but is rooted in being in unconditional love. It has a nature of being unconditional, not a list of things. If you meet this list that I create or this contract, then you can love me. That's kind of where I went with it.
Yeah.
And it was an really interesting study as I unpacked that. But, you were the one that mentioned the assumptions. Talk me through some of that too, how you kind of worked through some of those.
Yeah, man. So the first thing that I realized, the first thing that I struggled with the text, because, if Pastor Jim were here, because I talked with him about it a little bit as well, he would say the same thing, that Jesus is not making a statement about loving those who love you. Mm-hmm. He is in a sense, but in his broader point, he's talking about loving enemies. Mm-hmm. But even at that, he's really making even a broader point than that of saying love all people.
Yeah.
So he's not directly, and the reason that we struggle through this as students of the scriptures is because we always want to defer to the text. Mm-hmm. That's what Jesus was intending to say. That's what we want to preach about. And so when we're studying, we're like, man, what is Jesus saying here? What's he intending to communicate? His intention is saying is essentially love all people, mm-hmm. and kind of giving some color and flavor on how to do that. And the first thing that I noticed in the text was that he summarized that in the Golden Rule. So I was like, mm-hmm. okay, so the Golden Rule summarizes what Jesus means when mm-hmm. he's providing this ethic of love. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that really helped me to see that is comparing the parallel text in Matthew's gospel, because in Matthew's gospel, Jesus uses this as the conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount. And so I can't, it's like, I think it's in chapter 7. But it's like in my sermon, I said it's his mic drop statement. Like he gives all this powerful, difficult, mm-hmm. ethical mm-hmm. teaching. And it's like, here's all of that. If you just need the Spark Notes version or the too long didn't read, mm-hmm. do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you fulfill that, yeah, all the rest. But in this, I think he even says all the law and the prophets are fulfilled in this one statement, or something along those lines. So that was kind of the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was the function that verses 32 through 34 play in the broader argument. That they're not a point in and of themselves. They're sort of like a foil to Jesus's main point, which is more about enemies or those who are difficult to love. So, like in literature, a foil character, it's only there to provide contrast to or to support a main character. Mm-hmm. And so, in a similar way, Jesus is using this example where he's making some assumptions and trying to expose mm-hmm. the weakness mm-hmm. of transactional love in order to support this unconditional love that can extend out even to enemies. And so mm-hmm. the way that assumption language comes in is if you look into Greek, which actually I think I have a Greek New Testament back in those bins. It should be a blue hardcover book. Do you see what I'm talking about? It might be low. Yes. No.
Oh, they buy. There's three volumes. Oh, it's right here.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yes.
There it is.
Yes. So the reason I want to pull it out is just because because I don't remember the Greek off the top of my head for a first class conditional statement, but for if you've studied the Greek, which I know you have, you know what I mean when I'm talking about conditional statements and how there are different kinds. You know, in English, we use our inflection to demonstrate what we're assuming. So I would, like, I might say, you know, if I say the statement, "We all brush our teeth," or if you brush your teeth, then you won't have gum disease. I'll use my inflection to demonstrate whether or not I'm assuming that you're brushing your teeth or not. So if I say, like, if we all brush our teeth, we don't have gum disease. Like that, I'm sort of like assuming that we do brush our teeth, but there's nothing in the language that demonstrates that. Whereas in the Greek, there is. So you can demonstrate uncertainty or that you're assuming a positive result for the sake of argument. So when Jesus says, "If you love those who love you," in verse 32, in the Greek, it's A begins it, and then it starts with A, and it uses the it uses the indicative mood. So whereas if it's using the subjunctive mood, there's ways that you can tell in the Greek, which I'm like looking at. I'm like, I probably remember that. Probably remember what that is. So in that first statement that he makes is the first class conditional where he's assuming the positive. So that's where that language of assumption came from. The other two statements are undefined, which I thought was interesting, but I didn't really dig into that a whole lot. So that's kind of where that came from.
Which is true. I mean, in a sense.
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Like, as you dig in, the tension I was feeling with it was Jesus was making an assumption, but were they actually, is it actually true love? If it's transactional, that's the tension I was feeling was, if love is, it's not unconditional, if it's selfish, rooted in what we want for us, is that really love? And that's the tension. Absolutely.
And in addition to that, so Jesus is assuming that we're loving those who are close to us. And kind of exactly what you're saying, like, is that a safe assumption in my life that I'm loving those who love me, or loving those in that inner circle with the kind of love that Jesus is describing? And ultimately, I know from personal experience, hey man, there are days where that's not very safe. That's not a safe assumption. You know, there was an illustration that you provided where you were talking about contracts.
The environment, you knew that there was some conditions to feel love, and if you didn't meet up to those standards for whatever reason, you didn't feel like you were loved. And it was like a performance-based love. It was a performance-based home in some regard, and there are some families like that really struggle, and kind of built from that, but was built from that point, but was explaining that it's like we have contracts, and we think about our spouse, we think about, if they do blank, then I'll be able to show them love. Like, or you can make it you could reverse a statement and say, well, why would I show them love? They don't respect me. Or why would I show them love? They don't give me the time of day. Or why don't I? It's kind of reversing that thing. But in the same way we say, but if you flip that, it's, I will show you love if you do blank. And it's like a contract we create. And often the people don't even know that contract is there. But if they don't measure up to it, we struggle to say, okay, I'm going to love you unconditionally. There's obviously conditions or things that they have to do or not do in order for you to show them love.
Right.
And so we have those contracts, and we're handing them out to people. That was the analogy I used.
And I love that, just getting the chance to listen back to your sermon, because it connected up with something that I was reminded of as I was studying, which is this concept from a book called His Needs, Her Needs. It's a somewhat popular book for marriages. We got gifted 3 copies of it when Joy and I got married, and we read at least one of them. And it's a good book, and it's trying to raise up like, hey, here are some needs that men have in the context of marriage. Here are some needs that women have, and it's helpful to read just to gain perspective, for your spouse and for needs that the other gender has, things like that. In general, I would recommend the book. I even there's a chapter out of it that I use at times in premarital counseling. But there's this concept in the book called the love bank, and I want to describe it to you, and then let you just have a little conversation about it. So the idea of the love bank is that when you're filling the need of the other person, you're sort of there are things that fill up the love bank, and there are things that withdraw from the love bank. And so it's like you want to make sure kind of in the course of your marriage that you're not, notice when the love bank is low, or like if you're, hurting the other person or being inconsiderate of them, that's sort of like withdrawing from the love bank. But then when you provide for their needs and you're more attentive to them, then that can fill up the love bank. And so there are times where like, hey, we got to cancel something last minute, or, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I didn't tell you about that, but I have this thing going on. Like that's fine, but it withdraws from the love bank. Over a long period of time, though, if you're constantly, miscommunicating, you're constantly asking for forgiveness, you're constantly doing these things, then like eventually, and I know that this is not what the author is trying to say, but he tells all these stories about these affairs that happen because the needs are not getting met. And so the subtext is, if you withdraw too much, there's a danger that those needs are going to get filled elsewhere. That can lead to some unfortunate circumstances and sinful circumstances. So it's this idea that like there's a credit system that sort of like, and there are ways that I think it can be a helpful analogy, but like how does that compare with the teaching that Jesus is providing in the text? And is there a contradiction here?
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard that analogy. Ironically, I've heard it as the love tank. That's the 5 love languages. Dr. Chapman.
Oh, yes.
He talks about the love tank, and he uses it like a gas tank, where eventually you're running on fumes. So it's very similar.
Yes.
You keep putting fuel in it so that you can keep going. And you can run on the tank alone for a while, but eventually you'll run out of gas. I think for me, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, it's more of a conversation of... it's less of a conversation of what you're called to do and as far as sinning or not sinning, versus creating an atmosphere or an environment that is conducive most for love. So, for example, if somebody is prone to violence, or they get so angry that they hit somebody, right? And if I'm there, I can do it's wrong for them to hit me, right? But I can do things in my life to provide an environment in which they are less prone to act out in violence. Whereas if I am constantly prodding them, if I'm constantly doing things that frustrate them, if I'm constantly poking the bear, and then they sin by lashing out in violence, in a sense, I haven't. Yes, it's their responsibility not to sin. But I've created an environment in where is very conducive. Like you just go 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, well that makes sense. Yes, you were creating that environment. I think it's similar in marriage. Whereas if we're not meeting our spouse's needs, if we're not loving our spouse well, there's not intimacy, all these things, then naturally that's creating an environment, the perfect environment for sin to grow. And it's our job to be good cultivators of our relationship, and you don't want the soil to grow bad so bad things can grow. So for me, it's more about creating the environment versus the sin itself. It's being a good stewards of that environment, of creating that safe place where you can. So that's where I see the tension resolving in my mind, because you're right. Like, it's so easy to say, well, he wasn't loving me, so I found love elsewhere, or he wasn't meeting my needs in some way, so I went and found that other thing. And we validate that in big ways or in small ways. And again, that becomes very conditional in some ways. The point is this, you got to view what Jesus says solely just at face value first. Jesus
Right.
says to be unconditional in your love. Love others. That's what he says. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, love those who are close to you, love. Ultimately, that is the common denominator that he's calling us to. There are obviously other complicating issues and things that surround that, but it never validates. Like, Jesus is never going to say, wow, like, you know what? You're right. That was so hard. You didn't have to love. You're right. Like, you know, you choosing hatred and anger, you know what? Like, that was such a hard,
bitterness
messy.
and resentment.
Yeah, like, of course you're going to be bitter, right? And I hear a lot of Christians say that kind of thing. Well, like, you kind of have a right to be bitter. Like, what he did to you was so bad. It's like, but really, do we, though? I mean, yeah, it was terrible what he did to you. And by rights, it seems like you have every right to. But God's economy is different than the world's economy.
Right.
And so that's why what Jesus is calling us to is radical. That's why he says, those that love you, those that treat you well, those that get back to you, those are these things. Like, it makes sense when it's like, oh man, it's just like this economy where you're giving to me, I'm giving to you, and man, things are good, it's easy. But the number of times I've heard that, like, oh, like I'm just going to be frustrated for this one time, or I'm going to be bitter, and if you knew what they did to me, you would be bitter too. And it's like, well, probably I would, because I'd be sinning, but it's still wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. That's the key distinction is, like, when it comes to these relationships, I think it's fine to teach about, like, the love tank or the love make. I think it's a helpful concept.
Oh, 100%.
But when it starts to become an excuse to withhold love, that's where you've crossed the line. That's where it's gone from a helpful heuristic that encourages love to a contract that we're sort of holding one another's feet to the fire. And I just think it's so natural for us to fall into, at least it is for me. I know in my friendships, in my marriage, it's so easy to fall into the, well, you know, they're not really doing what we talked about. And so that justifies my giving them the cold shoulder, or that justifies my being a little bit upset with them or chippy with them. It's like, no, it doesn't. It's like that's transactional ways of thinking. But I do think it's as a tool for use for empathy, of like understanding, hey, these are the sorts of things that the other person would really love. That's where what we're actually doing is answering the question, if you were in their shoes, what would you have them do to you? Which is kind of the question that Jesus poses in the Golden Rule.
So I heard this recently, and this really I've been chewing on this a lot. So it's kind of undercooked, but just hear me out.
Sure.
I heard this in I think it was they're like marriage coaches, Christian marriage coaches, but it was like a reel or something on Instagram. And this guy said, we need to stop only thinking about how I sinned against my spouse. And we need to start thinking about, how have I allowed my actions to cause my spouse to sin? And we need to be willing to not only not sin, but not do things that we know will cause our spouse to sin. And so, for example, he'll give you 2 examples. If you have a spouse who's prone to gossip, okay, and you are freely sharing information that you know could serve as a temptation to become gossip for your spouse, you are in a sense enabling them, giving them the ability and prompting them to sin.
Yeah, creating an environment where it's
If they are prone to anger, if you know, like, you're not sinning, but you know that something you do causes them to become angry, why would I continue to do what I know will make my spouse sin? Even though I know that they need to grow in that area, you know, they need to grow in their gossip, or I'm just picking 2, anger, they need to grow in their lashing out. Like, obviously they're the ones that are in the wrong, they need to grow. But in the meantime, if I'm part of their sanctification process, why should I strive to be the catalyst to cause them to sin? And that's been huge for me recently. I've been chewing on that a lot, especially my marriage, but thinking about that, all relationships. We should be thinking about, you know, how can I be so gracious in my love that I'm willing to not only not hurt other people, but not even provide an opportunity for them to sin.
This was a huge conversation for me in college, because as a school, we all chose to give up certain things that were not wrong in order to create an environment where holiness was more likely to happen. So, like, for example, for years. It was called so I went to Taylor University. We had this thing called the LTC, the Life Together Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And
we signed the covenant at Grace.
Yeah.
I went to Grace College, rival school, but hey, we won't get into that.
Yeah.
Crossroads League.
But the LTC, it had all these for a long time, like no dancing.
Mm-hmm.
It like Taylor back in the day had a lot of rules like that.
Yeah.
It was a dry campus.
Campus for sure.
No
for
tobacco on campus.
Mm-hmm.
All that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was not that they were saying dancing is evil, drinking is evil, smoking is evil. They were saying, hey, for 4 years, we're going to give this up for the sake of having a healthier community, and for the sake of pursuing excellence, for the sake of pursuing holiness.
Yeah.
And like, when you we're not necessarily, so like in the Life Together Covenant, they didn't tackle whether or not these were sin issues. They were just saying we are striving to create an environment where sin is less likely to happen. And so like we're not going to do these sorts of things. And we're all going to choose gladly as a community to lay these down and to sacrifice them. Similarly in marriage, kind of to what you're saying, we don't have to insist on our rights to behave however we want. We can gladly choose to lay down behaviors or lay down hobbies or lay down these things that are superfluous to our lives to honor our spouse and to help to create an environment where love is more likely to thrive.
Yeah, you're right. And you got to ask a question like, what am I not willing to give up for the sake of love? It's a great question to ask. Like what is the one thing I'm not willing, like my freedoms, my rights, my masculinity, my whatever, and I think once you start boiling it down, like, am I truly willing, if God's called us to love people, especially people that are close to us, am I willing to give up? Like, what am I not willing to give up? Yeah. That's an interesting question to wrestle with.
For sure. And I think right now we're kind of thinking more in terms of like how to produce the healthiest relationships possible. But another thing that I'm thinking about and some questions I got asked have to do with the really unhealthy relationships.
Yeah.
So like, for example, hey, it's all well and good. And honestly, this is what Jesus is talking about. It's all well and good to be loving towards someone when generally they're having goodwill toward you.
Yeah.
Or when you're not, they're not going to turn it back around and take advantage of you. But like, what if I am actively being taken advantage of? Can I not stand up for myself? Can I not, is there no room for healthy boundaries? Are all boundaries in relationships just sort of these manipulative expectations, these strings attached? Is there ever a time when the relationship is so toxic that now I need to do something that's not loving, or I need to be less than nice? So like, how do you think you would respond to those sorts of
I'll add another layer to it. Someone asked, what happens if I have a friend, it's a toxic friendship, how do I need to continue to be their friend?
Right.
It's a great question to ask. Like, are we called to be everybody's friend? Is that what we're called to be? And like, some people would accuse me.
I mean, you are.
Some people would accuse me of like, I either have people that I don't know or they're my buddy. I'm like, yeah, he's my bro. He's my buddy. Yeah, he's my friend. He's like, well, have you talked to him? I haven't seen him since high school. And they're like, dude, you graduated like 2011. What do you mean you're not friends with him? Like, you don't even know him anymore. You know what I mean?
Right.
But like, I just kind of view everyone as my friend in a way. But they're not really my friend in a sense of that we have a deep relationship. So the question is like, how do we love, and how do we, if it's right, to have boundaries or classify people in our lives? One of the analogies that's always helped me is I have a ruler. I would have brought it today if I was thinking, but I take a ruler, and on the ruler there are inches, 12 inches if you didn't know, and each friendship represents inches on a ruler, but the ruler itself represents the time we have as a resource for relationships. We only have so much time, and so when you think about relationships that you're pouring into, especially friendships that you're really investing in, you only have so many inches. You could have 12 really shallow friendships. You could have 2 friendships that are like 6-inch friendships, and then you have no other time, for relationships. And what happens is, I think people don't realize that they're like, you have a capacity for friendships and deep relationships. and how there's some people that like know everybody, but they don't really have tons of deep relationships. And then there's some people they lean more towards like they have some 2 or 3 really deep friends, and then everybody else is pretty much an acquaintance, right?
Right.
And like there's some of this balance, and that's totally healthy. That is totally fine, and you can do that and still love people. It's important to understand though that you can, who you're letting invest in your life, who you're letting pour into you as you pour into them, and it seems like it's transactional, but it's just both of them are freely giving love and receiving love, and it's a very like edifying relationship. Who you let in that place is very important. So a couple things, and I'm rambling on, but I'll often think sometimes in my life I've had friends who take up a lot of inches on my ruler, and it's become toxic and unhealthy. And so I had to take steps to say, in order for me to love you, truly, in order for me to love you well, I have to remove you from the role you're playing in my life currently. And it's actually an act of love.
Yeah.
You're not loving them any less, but right now the place they're holding, what they're pouring into your life is causing, it's toxic, it's causing pain, it's causing hardship, it's causing you to be bitter towards them. And you're not getting out of the friendship what you need. And so in a sense, you can say, in order for me to love you, I can still love you totally, but you can have a different role and title in my life, and that's okay. Yeah. And so I think it's totally okay to say this friendship needs to be cut off for the sake of the friendship or for the sake of what it is currently, but I can still call them, a casual friend. I can still pray for them. I can still, when I see them, I'm polite, I'm loving them. But it might not be the same depth as what it is now. That's kind of how I would.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple different concepts that are overlapping that I think is just helpful to name. Yeah, like there's your relationship to the person, there's your love for the person, and then there's sort of like the niceties that So I think sometimes in these contexts of toxicity or like, hey man, I feel like I need to set some boundaries, but I don't want to just fall into this self-centered transactional love, but I feel like I kind of need to protect myself because it's not a safe situation. Like so some of those sorts of things. Yeah. Like you may have to change your relationship to that person. Like, hey, maybe if there's a safety question or if there's some of those things going on, maybe change the way that you're behaving around that person, or maybe you need to not be around them for a little while. That's not necessarily unloving. That's a change in the relationship. That's a change in how you're behaving. Yeah. But you can maintain a spirit of grace. You can be doing it in love to try to protect them from sin, to try to protect yourself from harm. Like I don't think Jesus is saying, be dumb and run into like every situation where you're just going to end up getting hurt. I think he's saying be considerate of one another and don't merely look into your own self-interest. And then a lot of times the niceties, people can be like, well, I don't want to say that because it feels unloving. Well, okay, but there are times where the loving thing to do is to tell someone something that's going to be painful for them. Like, hey, Charlie, I'm really sorry to say this, but when you said that to me, that actually hurt me deeply. And like, I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I just want to communicate well because I value this relationship. Some of those kinds of conversations.
Or even something like, I feel like we're heading in a different direction. Yeah. And so I would love for us to, maintain a casual friendship, but we're heading in different directions, and that's okay, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's some of the, because I think in both of our sermons, like whether it's talking about the contracts, or for me, I spent a lot of time talking about this transactional loving is not other-centered. It's not unconditional. It's the opposite of those things. Yeah. And that's wrong, and it's going to be damaging when you have all these expectations. There's a counterpoint to all of that, which is sort of the counterpoint of accountability, of having healthy boundaries. Yeah. Because if you're never allowed to hold people's feet to the fire, then I think some of these relationships that God wants for us within the church even are impossible to have. I think some of the most loving conversations I've had with people have been some of what on the front end were some of the hardest conversations, where it's like they were telling me things that were hard to hear, but that I needed to hear, or for me telling them things that were hard to hear, but that were absolutely necessary to share. Yeah. So like in those accountability contexts or those healthy boundaries contexts, There can still be wisdom there.
Yeah.
But but we still want to maintain a spirit of grace, a spirit of doing things in their best interest.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that I.
Yeah. One of the things you said. One of the things you said was interesting about the difference between the love and the relationship. Which segues to a question I have for you. Jesus modeled that, and because we see did Jesus love Nicodemus? Yes. Did he love the centurion? Yes. Did he love Zacchaeus? Yes. Did he love, you go right down the line, all these people that he met with or that you see him interact with? Yes. Did he still have his 12? Well, yes. Did he still have his inner circle? Right? Yes. The 3, right? We see that Jesus wasn't communing and having intimate conversations and relationships with every person he loved and came in contact with, but yet he still showed love and compassion and mercy on all the people he came in contact with. And so you're right, there can be differences in relationships. That's how we're wired. That's how we're created. We're not created to be able to handle a deep relationship with everybody we come in contact with, and that's okay, right? So then one of the things that you really drove home in your message was, Jesus setting the example on this. So I gave one example of what he did when he was physically here on earth, but what are some other ways when you think about unconditional, non-transactional love? What are some other ways that Jesus sets the example that we can follow in your mind?
Yeah, I think for me the absolute biggest example is what it talks about in Hebrews 12, which is where I close the sermon, which it was while he was on earth. But you were talking about in the context of these relationships where he was able to love, but also have different kinds of relationships.
Correct. I was talking more about his day-to-day relationships with humans is what I was referring to.
But in Hebrews 12 is sharing how Jesus is, I love the language in the NIV, it says the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. That pioneer language is just so, sometimes it's translated, he's the trailblazer, like that kind of idea, where Jesus is, this is kind of how I close my sermon, by talking about how when we sacrifice for the sake of love, when we sacrifice our own preferences, when we sacrifice our time, when we sacrifice, our right to get something in return, we're following a well-worn path of believers who have been following the example of Jesus, ultimately in the cross. And so I don't know if I brought it up in both services, but that moment in the garden where Jesus says, Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. And then he makes the transition to saying, but not my will, but yours be done. That to me is one of the ultimate examples of choosing self-sacrificially to love. Jesus makes this decision to know, even though I'm not gonna get a whole lot out of this, which in some ways I think what did Jesus have to gain from going to the cross, right? It was for the joy set before him, but he himself was sacrificing his life, and he could have lived forever in heaven. Jesus, as a part of the Godhead, is a self-sufficient being. So he did not need us. So he wasn't gaining something that he needed by going to the cross, but he was gaining something that he wanted by pursuing us. So to me, that's the chief example, is Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And that I think is the powerful thing. Sometimes we talk about atonement theory. Sometimes,
sometimes, once in a while.
And we can, we're like, penal substitutionary atonement type boys. Or we talk about Christus Victor for getting exotic,
Yeah.
But there's all these other theories of the atonement that have to do with Christ as the exemplar. In what sense did Jesus save us? In one sense, the atonement has to do with him paying the penalty of sin. That might be the penal substitutionary atonement. He takes the wrath of God onto himself, and he as a result, we're free from the penalty of our sin. And that you could also say, man, he defeats the enemy. He conquers the power of sin and death on the cross. He's the victor. He wins a victory for us over sin and death, so that we can win a victory in his name, or we can follow him in that victory. But then there's all these other theories that have to do with, well, in what sense did Christ save us? Well, he set an example for us in how we live. Sometimes they're called subjective views of the atonement. And a lot of people dismiss them out of hand. But in the context of talking about love and Jesus' example in love, this is where I feel like these other atonement views, they're helpful to have in the back pocket.
Yeah.
Because they can add a lot of color to our appreciation for what happens on the cross. It's not just a convenient math error. It's not just like, oh, I'm really glad that happened, so now we don't have to deal with that headache.
Yeah.
It's also like, no, this is an example that we should follow. In.
Yeah, I've heard it said recently in a book I was reading. It was like, in order for us to truly live resurrection lives, we have to be willing to live crucified lives.
Yes.
It's very similar. This is a good question. Thinking about the garden, how Jesus said, take this cup from me. What if you don't want to love? What if it's so hard? What if you're caught in that situation where you are the one who is experiencing hurt and pain and the person isn't deserving of love by all human accounts? And you just don't, you want, in your flesh absolutely wants to withhold love. And you just cannot love that. You just are struggling. What do you say to that person? Because we would be remiss to not mention that there are people that are just like, I just don't want to.
For sure.
I mean, because there are sins in my life that, like, if I'm being honest, there are times I'm like, I know it's wrong, but I still want to do it. I don't want to give this up.
Sure.
In my flesh, right?
It's the goldfish.
It's the goldfish. Yeah. I don't want to give this up,
I don't want to give up goldfish.
And so,
it's good. I think when it comes to those sorts of situations, to me it's feels a little bit similar to if you had a person who was like, hey man, you need to go to the hospital, and the person's like, well, I don't want to go to the hospital, and you're like, dude, you are bleeding all over the place. We got it. Please get in the ambulance, please. And the person's like, no, I refuse. I refuse care. It's like, well, this is not going to go well for you. Like you can refuse care, you can stay at home, but you're doing so to your own detriment. Yeah. And I think when we allow the enemy and then when we allow sin to get a foothold in our hearts by saying, no, I'm going to hold on to bitterness, or I'm going to hold on to my apathy, there's some really strong warnings in the text for folks who find themselves in those places. Yeah. If you read the 7 letters to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's one of the churches Jesus talks about, like they're lacking of zeal, or they've let go of their first love. Like these ideas that we need to be called back into zeal. We need to be called back into our attentiveness to what Jesus is calling us to, because if we're not careful, that apathy, that, well, I just really don't want to, it's a disease that will grow into sin in our hearts. And so for me, I would treat it like I would encourage the person, for your own good, ask God to change that. Yeah. Ask God to breathe his love into you. And especially if it's, I don't want to love them because of what they did to me, or I don't want to love them because I can't forgive them for something, now we're talking about bitterness and harboring unforgiveness. That's, the age old quote of, you're drinking poison expecting the other person to die. Not only are you sinning by withholding forgiveness, but you're also, missing an opportunity to grow and become more like Christ by walking in that path. Yeah.
And if you're struggling with hate for somebody, you just hate them for what they did. I think sometimes this is rooted in I often think of Jeffrey Dahmer, just sick murderer, mass murderer. And the fact that he got saved because a pastor went to prison and shared the gospel with him. And man, Lord, I pray that I could have the kind of love that I could go share the gospel with a man like that. Yeah. And it's just, within us, we're he deserves to burn for what he did, right? And that's what we feel in our, we're all fired up in our justice. And it's yes, so do I. I deserve to burn for what I've done. That's right. And so I think a really practical thing is that if you're struggling to love somebody, start praying for them.
For sure.
It's really hard to dislike somebody. It's hard to hate somebody and not care for somebody and be angry at somebody if you're praying for them. It's really hard to keep that up. So I think a great first step, if you can't talk to somebody because you're so hurt and you just cannot figure out how to love them, just start praying for them.
And a lot of times what happens when you pray for somebody is it's a recognition of their humanity. It's a recognition of, man, there's more going on here than just they're a bad person who's evil and that sort of thing. Like, even because like you could pray for them like some imprecatory psalms, and like that would be
you're right. But what did Jesus pray when they were persecuting or when they were killing him? Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. He prayed for his in that moment. By all rights, they were his enemy, and he said, "Forgive them, Father,
right?
For they know not what they do." Yeah,
and that's we're obviously referencing just the text right before the golden rule, where Jesus says, pray for those who, for your enemies, do good to them, these sorts of things. That recognizing their humanity, recognizing that because we are saved by grace, we need to, in order to get to a place of forgiveness, we need to wish that their sins are also paid for on the cross and not by them. Those sorts of like shifts that you can make in your mind. Prayer is super helpful for that because it humanizes that person. It helps you to empathize with that person. And that's, I think, a part of the genius, as I put it, of the golden rule is you're thinking, well, how would I want to be loved? Because in the ESV especially, it talks about the phrasing of the golden rule is that which you wish others would do to you, do so to others, which that reflects the word order of the Greek. Yeah. So the first idea is how you wish that you were treated. And then that causes you to think about, okay, so I know what it feels like to be loved. That person probably would like to be loved. So how can I do that sort of thing for them?
And I think you have to trust that there's grace as you learn and as you figure this out. And so you can trust too that God's going to fill that love gap where you fall short in love. Like God is abounding in love. So we can revel in that truth and say, Lord, I'm trying and I want to take that first step, but I'm still harboring bitterness. I'm still struggling. Continue to meet me where I am, continue to fill in the love gap in my relationships, in where I'm struggling with this, and help me in my sanctification process become more like you in one specific way, and that's loving this person that's hard to love or whatever. Yeah. And not feeling like, I guess what I'm getting at is we don't have to feel woe is me or also feel like we are failing God as we're growing. God's not saying I'm so disappointed with you. You don't get this love thing. Like, wow.
And that's the whole concept of spiritual breathing from that Jim loves to talk about, is this idea that you don't have, like, you cannot just endlessly give line. If you think of, I thought of this example. I didn't use it in my sermon, but when I was prepping, sometimes I'll go down with my brothers and my dad, and we'll go fishing in the Keys. And so when you're deep sea fishing, if you're trolling, a fish will come in and take the line. And when you're fishing like in a pond, the first thing you do is set the hook and you start reeling in because you don't want the fish to get away. You don't want the line to snap. Yeah. In deep sea fishing, you set the hook and then you just let them run because you cannot fight that fish. So you just let them. You just say, take line, let them take line, and you keep your you want to make sure the line's not getting tangled, but you just let them run, and your rods have just hundreds and hundreds of feet of line on them. And so there's this idea that you can let them take line, but eventually, like if you get a massive tuna on the hook, you can't let them take line forever. Now, thankfully they don't, because they get tired, and that's when you start fighting them. But in these relationships, we only have so much line to give. We're finite creatures. Yeah. And so you can't just let people walk all over you eternally unless you're connected to infinite source. That's right. And so that's where that idea of spiritual breathing, that idea of I need to be poured into, I need God's grace in my life. That is and this is, when I said in at least one of the services, the only reason this makes sense is because of Jesus. Yeah. If I didn't say it, I had that in my manuscript. The reason I can say that is because endlessly giving line is exhausting. It's impossible, humanly speaking. Because if we're just operating in this like system of scarcity, man, I don't have enough. What is going to happen to me? I'm going to starve. I won't have enough for myself, and then I'm going to die.
Yeah.
But if we're operating in a system where the Spirit of Christ is living in me, and He's ministering to me, and He's pouring His love into me, that really, so then I'm not really giving out of myself when I'm self-sacrificially loving.
Yeah.
I'm actually giving out of the love that God has poured into me. And so I can be full even though I'm being poured out like a drink offering. It's that rhythm of coming back to the well, which is why I think it's important to point to Jesus whenever we're talking about ethical living, because it's draining, and we don't have what it takes unless Christ is pouring into us. So that's absolutely, if you're feeling depleted, or you're feeling like, man, I just don't know how I can make this work, because especially if it's like a long-term relationship, like a marriage, or like a good friendship that you're committed to, or a work relationship that you're like, I can't easily get out of this. Asking for God's grace in the midst of that, to fill you up, to give you His love for that person, so that you have something to selflessly pour out, even though it's going to be costly.
It's good.
Yeah, man. Fishing in the Keys, dude. Something else.
Do you get seasick?
I have before, but I don't normally. I have a brother who does, and
I do.
We tell jokes about it.
I
You
try-
get seasick? You're such an outdoorsman, Charlie.
Put me on a mountain. Altitude sickness doesn't bother me. Put me on a mountain, my feet firmly planted. But if I'm in the air too much, or if I'm in the water, especially the water when the boat's going like this.
Yeah.
I have to ask Rachel sometime about when I went scuba diving. Tried to go scuba diving, and my ears I couldn't get my ears to pop, so I couldn't go down. I couldn't get down. I kept trying to get my ears to pop, and they wouldn't pop. And I was pushing hard, and then like I pushed so hard that my crystals, my ears, and all of a sudden like I'm climbing up the rope in the water like this. And like the whole world's going sideways, and I'm like trying to climb up to the surface.
Oh my God.
And then I get up on the surface, and the whole thing's like this, and I crawl up on the boat, and I'm just laying there, and the whole world's like spinning upside down, and then all of a sudden it comes right to, and I'm like, and then I just start just puking over the edge of the boat.
Oh my gosh.
For the next, everyone else is down there scuba diving, I'm just like, just over the boat. It was,
yeah,
we divert. I don't know what that wasn't very loving of me. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So like, are you able to like go on Cedar Point rides? I love
roller coasters.
Okay.
Anything spinny, and generally speaking, boats are fine. It's when boats stop for a long time.
Sure.
And I'm doing something else, and they start doing this. That's when it really gets to me.
So are you not a fisher?
I'm not a fisherman.
Interesting.
I'm really not. Like
I would not have guessed that.
I'll go out once in a while. I have way too many hobbies to be a fisherman. I never got into it. Like I never really like. I think I like to just shoot when I'm going after.
Harpoon guns, dude.
There you go. Yeah, maybe I could. I think I could get into harpooning or bow fishing. I think I could really get into bow fishing. Okay. That would be fun. But like casting a line, like I guess like what I grew up around, like there are like white bass fishing off like on Lake Erie when the white bass are hit. That's really fun. Do the flutter again.
Oh no.
When you can't, but like that, you like literally cast, and as fast as you can reel in, you're reeling in bass.
Yeah, so that's what deep sea fishing at its best. You're not doing a whole lot of sitting around. It's a lot of trolling, and then when you get something on, we could talk.
See, I think I would enjoy that more. But like sitting at a pond for bass and like reel and let the bobber go.
Yeah, no, dude. Dude, 20 miles out, halfway to Cuba, and then like catching mahi.
Wow, man.
That's the stuff.
I could enjoy that. I think I would give it a shot.
Yeah, I would. I need like other people to guide me to do it, but it's like
take some Dramamine and go.
Oh yeah, dude, it's so much.
Wear
fun.
My C-bands, and I'll be set.
Yeah. Anyhow,
we get back to the text.
Yeah, let me see. We've got probably time for one more question. So in that second section of the text, Jesus repeats this phrase, even sinners do that. What good is it if you love those who love you? Even sinners do that. Mm-hmm. We both kind of shared about so when I was preaching about that, I was talking about how this kind of love that's more transactional, it comes naturally to the world. Why does it come naturally to the world? Because it's self-focused.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take, you don't have to be pursuing holiness to act in self-interest. That's just the fallen human condition. As we look out for ourselves, we try to survive. And so that, you would expect to find that kind of love rampant in the world.
Yeah.
How did you kind of frame that kind of concept in your sermon?
Even sinners did that. I think I was picturing the crowd gathering around and hearing Jesus say the golden rule, which they all would have heard and probably understood or known, and then hearing phrases.
Yeah.
Like, well, if you love those who love me, and they're like, oh yeah, well, yeah, okay, I do that. Well, what good is that to you? And he's like, wait, what? Like, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that, right? I was picturing that that they like would have been hearing this for the first time and saying, wait a minute, wait, what? Like, wait. So you're saying, calling me to love? Well, yeah, I love people, but you're calling me to something different. And actually adding some depth to the golden rule. That's one thing that's interesting about the golden rule and about Jesus is that he uses a common phrase, but I think he does it on purpose because now he wants to flip the narrative on it and add depth to it.
Sure.
And so, you are. I also when I think he keeps using that sinner thing because I preached a couple extra verses there at the end, he's making a juxtaposition between two things, right?
That's right.
And do you want to identify with sinners in your love, or do you want to identify with something greater, with Christ in your love?
Mm-hmm.
And so he keeps using that sinner thing because that transactional love that he mentions, that's what's fleshly. That's the kind of love that's connected to our survival, to our flesh. It's what's rooted in our sin nature.
And in that sense, it's natural.
It's natural. And it's how everyone else is doing it.
Right.
And so in a sense, if you want to stand out as different, here is how we can be different in how we love. And so I think that's why he kept saying, even sinners do that, even sinners do that. But I'm not calling you to be sinners. I'm not calling you to live like sinners. What I'm calling you to is very radical, very different, unnatural, if you will, and impossible apart from the power of Christ within us. It's truly impossible to love in an unconditional way without the Spirit, Holy Spirit guiding us. And that's why it's so countercultural to at the time. Jesus is saying, I'm loving and I'm teaching you how to love in such a way that only the Spirit's work in your life can bring forth that love in its truest sense.
Yeah.
Because our flesh is so strong, and we're always getting hurt, and we're always struggling, and we're always reeling back from something that happened, and then letting that impact how we treat people around us. So that's kind of what I did with it, I guess. I'm not very good at short answers. Neither are you. So I'm a good company.
Yeah. That's how we have a podcast.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I think that's a helpful thing for us to remember, that this sort of love does not come naturally, and so you shouldn't expect it to be this thing that just without any effort just sort of pops up in your life.
Yeah.
That's why the title of my sermon was Choosing Jesus' Kind of Love.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, I was kind of unpacking the golden rule and describing that love, and then kind of raising some questions about how that applies to those close to us. And then the point of my sermon was to challenge people: choose this kind of love. Yeah, because it's not going to happen by accident.
That's right. Can I see the Bible real quick?
I mean, sure.
The Holy Word. Thank you. So one thing that I kind of pulled out a little bit is then your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked.
Is that verse 36?
35.
Okay.
Be merciful just as you are my Father's merciful. That's verse 36. But verse 35 was interesting about that verse, and thinking about even sinners do that, right? Is a reminder that who are the ungrateful and the wicked? That was us.
Yeah.
So we did love like that at one point. And he's calling us out of something. It's not, okay, you have two choices. Here's two groups of people. Which one are you going to choose? He's saying, no, that's where you were. That's who you were. But because of Christ, we now have been changed. And we once were those people that Jesus even says that God himself was kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. He was loving to us first when we were sinners. But in another way, it's reminding us that love, that sin love that the sinners show, was the love that's all that we could do. That was all we had the capacity for.
Yeah.
But now through the Spirit's work in us, we have a capacity for a new kind of love, and that's what he's calling us to. So that was an interesting kind of connection that I saw there in the text. But
yeah, and I think that's a good place to end, just recognizing that. And this is one of the things I said right at the beginning of my exposition of the text is I said this is one of those times where the teaching of Jesus is so clear, you almost wonder if unpacking it is going to do more harm than good, because we might just explain it away. We might just get so interested in thinking about what it means that we don't feel the need to wrestle with it and follow it. Mm-hmm. And we should be, I believe, convicted by the clarity of Jesus's words, like in this passage, because none of us has cornered the market on loving self-sacrificially. That's something we're all going to struggle with and continue to struggle with. Mm-hmm. But the excuse is not the response is not to make excuses for it. The response is to say, okay, so how can I do this more faithfully? Well, number one, just like you were just saying, recognize how God has loved you.
Yeah.
Number two, recognize how Jesus has set the example. Number three, recognize how Jesus would want you to love that person by doing that reflective work, humanizing them, thinking about you, practicing empathy. And then number four, receiving God's grace, receiving his love to then choose to do it.
And the power of the Spirit within you for that.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's where,
it's so good, man.
I think it's a fun conversation to have, and it raises even a bunch of stuff that we didn't even get to talk about. But at the end of the day, what we should be taking away is do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's calling us to love, and he's giving us the tools and the blueprint on how to do it.
Yeah.
And so it's possible because of Christ. We can do it.
Right.
And that we can be encouraged by that no matter how hard your situation is, you always can love in that situation because he's paved the way, like you said, and he's given us all we need to be able to do it.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
Well, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. And thanks you guys so much for joining us for this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. We love having these conversations and getting to bring you into them. If you haven't checked us out yet, check us out on YouTube. We got a new little podcast studio going on, and so you can check it out. We post these episodes to YouTube whenever we're able to. Give us a little like, give us a little subscribe. You know, all the stuff that the YouTubers tell you to do that I don't have memorized. Click the bell, all that sort of thing. It all helps us to know that you're finding these conversations helpful, interesting, that you're receiving them, that God is using them in your life to help you become more and more like Christ. And that's the goal for these conversations. So we love you. We're praying for you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. But don't let the conversation end here. Find a group where you can deepen your roots at connect.opendoor.tv. And don't forget to submit your questions to podcast@opendoor.tv. Have a great week, and we'll see you Sunday.